colleagues, how fantastic to see you all here, and well done because of the trains. Congratulations on navigating our transport system, and I think it looks like a full house, so congratulations and thank you. There are just one or two very small things to mention. The first is that lunch today, the most important thing to keep you going through the day, is in two different places, as it was at the Tower. Here, where you are, at 12:45, and the other place is in our learning centre, where some of you already will be for some of the sessions. So the usual rule applies: stay where you've had your session, and it'll be the same food, so I promise you that. For those of you who are coming to the DemHist AGM, which is at 11:45, we're going to relocate to our learning centre, and if you just follow me and one or two other colleagues, we'll get you there. But I'm not going to do any more announcements because I want to crack on as much as possible, because it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Maria Balshaw. Maria is director of TATE. Now, TATE is a family of 4 galleries: TATE Modern, TATE Britain, TATE Liverpool, and TATE St Ives. Her recent work in Manchester included the transformation of the Whitworth Gallery, which was named Art Fund Museum of the Year in 2015, and where she's been all about making the arts and art relevant to the wider public. Maria began her career in academia before working for Arts Council England in Birmingham, and then becoming the director of the Whitworth in 2006. She quickly became a key figure in the development of Manchester's cultural scene, curating radical and popular programs and expanding the city's art collections. In recent years, she spearheaded the Whitworth's £17 million transformation, which, as well as winning the Museum of the Year, was nominated for the Sterling Prize, which is the UK's leading architectural award. At the same time, she was Director of Culture for Manchester City Council, working towards the launch of The Factory, which is a new arts venue and permanent home for the Manchester International Festival. She was awarded a CBE in the honours in 2015 for services to the arts. Now, Maria became Director of TATE in June this year. She's the first woman to be appointed to the role, and she says that she's looking forward to developing TATE's reputation as the most artistically adventurous and culturally inclusive gallery in the world. It currently receives 5.8 million visitors a year. After the visit to the TATE galleries, Maria wants people to feel that they've seen the most adventurous art, been part of a conversation about what art is, and feel comfortable with it. She says we absolutely need to be speaking to the whole of our society. Colleagues, Maria Balshaw.
Very pleased to be here today. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope you've had a wonderful few days in the UK. I couldn't imagine a more extraordinary set of institutions to be exploring, so I'm rather envious of the time you've had. But I'm very pleased to speak to you this morning. If I begin by asking what makes art relevant to our lives, I'd start by saying that joy, curiosity, and wonder that people take in art and in the objects and the heritage in our care is surely the beating heart of any museum or heritage space. So I wanted to begin today by sharing with you what will be going on at Tate Modern right now while we're sitting quietly here in this conference room. And it is this. This is the new installation in Tate Modern's Turbine Hall, produced by the Danish art collective Superflex. They've conceived it, in their words, as an idea of movement and power by people coming together and creating an action. Titled 1, 2, 3, Swing, it is a sculptural installation with swings that extends through Tate Modern's Turbine Hall out into the surrounding landscape and, we hope, by the end of the exhibition period, across sites in Southwark and London as the project expands its tentacles. with swings to create energy, laughter and ownership, and a carpet to let people lie down. Very beautiful carpet. And as the artists recommend, cultivate apathy. The artists place people as the energy creators at the heart of this power station, now Culture Hub in London. Superflex want to make the Turbine Hall a covered street, a civic space activated by people engaged in playful creation. The anarchic spirit suggests not so much art installation as playground, although as you can imagine some grumpy art critics have done the whole "is this really art" thing, but rather 1, 2, 3 swing suggests that there is a deep political and cultural need for playful action that brings strangers together in an act of collective pleasure, taking ownership of the formerly high cultural spaces of art and occupying the city for free. In the times we're living in, with last year's Brexit vote a clear signal of a profoundly divided and unequal country, and the shadow of Grenfell Towers a sobering reminder of the consequences of such economic and social inequalities, I would say that there is a deep necessity and political seriousness to such cultivation of joy in action. Even the directors of TATE in its entirety and the director of TATE Modern need such action. It suggests something we want more of at TATE. The years since TATE Modern opened have seen a fundamental shift, I think, in how we see museums, our heritage, and the role of art and artists in our lives and societies. So we shouldn't be surprised by signs like this. Our art galleries and heritage spaces have been exploring, ever more successfully, in my opinion, the idea that access to art, culture, and heritage might indeed change the world. We've seen the emergence of a confident, popular, but also political mode of cultural and artistic activity. Artworks that capture the public imagination and invite them to participate have been part of Tate Modern's DNA since it opened, with celebrated works like Olafur Eliasson's The Weather Project or Doris Salcedo's Shibboleth changing global perceptions of what contemporary art is and what the art museum is for. Going even further than this, in the very fabric of the expanded Tate Modern building, and I hope that many of you have been able to see it on your visit to London this month, built into that expanded building is a whole floor premised on the notion that dialogue between the museum and its audiences can be generative. It's a floor called Tate Exchange, and the clue is in the name. It is to help shape the artistic vision of the whole organisation through the exchange of ideas, as well as change the nature of who wants to come to our institutions. So Tate Exchange has given associates from the farthest reaches of the cultural world, architects, activists, musicians, city planners, educators, dancers, a whole floor to stage a dialogue about the art spaces we want and need for the now that we're living in. It's a vision I am only in support of as I take up the reins as director of Tate. As we've heard already, I want us to be the most artistically adventurous and culturally inclusive global art museum. Tate should be connected internationally to partners and art centres across the globe, and at the same time, locally rooted and relevant to people in London, Liverpool, and St Ives. This is not an absolutely new story for Tate, but it is a vision that makes more explicit an intention to connect the greatest art and artists to a wider and ever more inclusive audience. At Tate Modern, this means shaping an ever more diverse global art history, and at Tate Britain, it means presenting a more diverse and international conception of Britishness and British art. Liverpool and St Ives, our other branches, must be places where the best of the national collection and international art is shared with audiences outside London, and where new relationships with audiences and new learning paradigms can be piloted and tested in these more intimate and locally rooted environments. I would say we still have some way to go if we are to live up to TATE's unique and powerful mission to be an inclusive global museum. We are perhaps halfway down a road that TATE has set out to travel. We may never absolutely reflect the demographics of the cities around us. So we can't force every single person to love art and heritage. But I see it as our social and ethical responsibility to strive for relevance and a feeling of connectedness for the widest range of communities in our cities and our towns, as well as with audiences who visit from all over the world. I want to ensure that the many, not the few, find their TATE and feel a sense of ownership and connection to the art that we show. We must also, I think, make the case for lifelong creativity and the place of the arts in our education curriculum, in order that young people have the creative skills and collaborative habits to thrive in the 21st century. This notion of an integrated social and artistic mission meets the requirements of our public funding. And it also represents major opportunities in maintaining our audience levels and our attractiveness to funders, whether they be public or private. It is, I think, the key to future relevance and sustainability. So what do I mean exactly by relevance? My invitation to speak here this morning came from the organisers with a brief that said the conference had taken inspiration from Nina Simon's book, The Art of Relevance. As I'm sure many of you will know, she starts to think of relevance as a key. She says, imagine a locked door. Behind the door is a room that holds something powerful, value, experience, but the room is locked. So it seemed appropriate to share a recent example of work at TATE Britain that started with a firmly locked door. I think I have to point that way. What we have here is Oscar Wilde's prison cell door alongside a portrait of the artist as a young man. This summer, Queer British Art at TATE Britain has been a test case for how relevant and emancipatory our relationship with the art of the past can be. The show marked the 50th anniversary of the decriminalisation in England and Wales of sex between consenting men, which happened in 1967. Its historical starting point was the point at which sodomy, as it was called then, ceased to be a capital crime in England, which was 1861. It was relevant in marking a moment and relevant in making it clear how far we have moved. Wilde's cell door, on loan from Reading Jail, was hung alongside a similarly sized, very exuberant portrait of him at the height of his creative powers. The show both celebrated the creative genius of very many queer artists who in their lives had to hide their sexuality, or, like Wilde, were persecuted for its disclosure, or those artists who were brave enough to openly, if often silently, declare their sexual preference, like this magnificent self-portrait by Gluck from the early 20th century. The exhibition drew largely on the National Collection of British Art at TATE. It included very many well-known works, but explored for the first time the sexuality of the artist, sitters, and subject matter as something which can help us understand better the aesthetics as well as the politics of these artists and 19th and 20th century British art history. That prison door reminds us that the locked door is not always a metaphor, and that the consequences of connecting to their own identity and history has, until recently, had severe and punitive consequences for many people, including artists. The exhibition came as a suggestion from our own staff diversity forum, where LGBTQ staff members said that when they looked for their history, and their artist precedents, they found none or no one, even though they were certain there was an important, if difficult, story to be told. This only reminds us of the important point that if we want our audiences to be more diverse, then we must also support such diversity internally. A long period of research and confidence building was required in the making of this show, as many staff members felt vulnerable both about their own participation in the project and its likely reception. And there was a desire that the show should be recognised as an integrated rather than a niche history. There was also a very strong feeling that the exhibition should serve to connect in practical and new ways to the extremely diverse communities of queer people in London and beyond. So a network of community champions, celebrity endorsers, academics, radio journalists, with the BBC being a particular help, was constructed. Throughout the summer, Tate Britain flew the rainbow flag. In July, Pride London was launched at the gallery. Our spaces offered a building-based anchor for a festival that usually only takes place on the streets in London. Over the course of a weekend, we were able to welcome a very wide range of LGBTQ audiences as part of just being open to everyone. This meant child-focused day festival, because queer audiences also have children and families. We had intergenerational activities, readings, performances, as well as research-led tours, historical investigation, scholarly sharing. And yes, later on, there was a party that celebrated queer club culture, led by one of London's leading voguing performers. The partnership with Pride and the exhibition itself also made us able to make the obvious but important point that our blockbuster David Hockney exhibition, which was on at the time, is art by one of the greatest British gay artists, a queer icon since his own youthful refusal to keep his sexuality out of his pictures, despite homosexuality still being illegal when he was emerging as a star artist. We were even able to take queer British art out onto the streets. This was our own float as part of the Pride Parade, and Gluck got to see an even larger audience. The exhibition has met with huge acclaim from critics and, more importantly, from the public. It massively exceeded our already quite high audience targets by 35% in numerical terms. But even more significant is the shift in who has been coming to this exhibition. 56% of the audience were happy to self-declare as LGBTQ. There was a doubling of our under 30-year-old audience and a large increase in Black and minority ethnic visitors. Most telling of all, though, are the comments cards that came at the end of the exhibition, which make the case far better than I can for the need for relevance in showing and sharing our national art collection. One card simply said, "I think it might be safe to come out now." Another said, "I have wept twice in my life. Today at 75, I find myself in tears again in front of a prison door." And another one said, "Last week my mum told me she didn't believe I was gay and mentioned that she didn't want to offend me as a human being. Today I feel she offended herself for not seeing how great a person I am. Thanks, Tate, for giving me hope." There were thousands of comments, more than we have ever had from any exhibition, and they ranged from the deeply profound and sad to absolutely celebratory, and really affirmed the importance of making an exhibition like this. But it wasn't the only thing going on in the Tate Empire over the summer. I've had quite a good time since I arrived on June 1st. Running at the same time as Queer British Art was Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, this time at Tate Modern. This has been another exhibition which has utterly exceeded our expectations. As well as 40% more overall visitors, and 5-star reviews all round, Black and minority ethnic audiences have accounted for 33% of all visitors to this paying show. That is nearly 3 times what we would normally expect from a Tate Modern exhibition. More than 65% of the visitors have been under 35 and 33% are below 24. This is, again, double what we would usually see. The theme of the show had much to do with this, but so too did the way in which we chose to present and talk about it. From the outset, we sought to use different ways in order to spread the word about the exhibition. We made media partnerships with different publications like The Voice, who have particular authority in London's black communities. Posters were placed in areas such as Lambeth, Peckham and Britain, where we knew there were significant black British audiences. The very cool and also very critical of white authority Black Superman poster certainly helped, although it was one of the most difficult negotiations we've ever had with Universal Music to get permission to represent the Superman sign. And you learn all sorts of things doing shows like this. But perhaps most powerfully of all, we worked with prominent figures who we felt could help us reach the audience we were trying to attract. Where in the past we might have relied on the art critics, not so influential with the audience we wanted to reach. Instead, with this show, we've worked with artists like Jay-Z, Solange Knowles-Ferguson, Will Smith, Spike Lee, and Laura Mvula. My kids now think I'm reasonably cool since I've met Will Smith and Spike Lee. The point about those people is that their millions of followers on social media got to hear about the show from their heroes rather than us. And that transference of authority is really very important. Solange Knowles' impact was a particular revelation. Inspired by a photograph by veteran artist Betty Saar, and looking at the role that Betty Saar played in the Black Arts movement in the 1970s, Solange examined her sense of identity as a black woman today. She created an interactive work that was a spin-off from films she was making for her recent tour. This was viewed on Tate's website, and on the 25th of August, she made a selection of her work that was projected as part of the Tate Late at Tate Modern. This attracted thousands of new, young visitors to the gallery. She also wrote 5 posts about this work on her Instagram page. She has 3.1 million followers. So it is not an insignificant thing when that happens. But alongside those stars, we gave a space within the show, I've lost the slide there, for young black performers who had been drawn from the constituencies around Southwark. So what was interesting, I think, about Soul of a Nation is that it caught a particular cultural moment. And this has not so much to do, in fact, with it being an African-American show that felt relevant to young black audiences. In fact, I think there's a slightly crude and questionable correlation between African-American art being appealing to black British audiences. But the correlation that has definitely been there is that the show has spoken to a desire at the moment to see art that is activist, political, and urgent. In this, the show is connected to the UK's post-Brexit, pro-Corbyn feeling that people need to speak up and act. But the show also presented a very complex, nuanced view of what black art is. In fact, it suggested that there is no such thing as one kind of black art. So you saw grand landscape works like this Frank Bowling piece, which was in a room full of abstract African-American art, which was a very important new aspect to the show, alongside activist posters, conceptual pieces, folk art, and representational painting. So the whole exhibition is conceived of a research project, and it seeks to educate in political and aesthetic terms simultaneously. And it's this that has brought in such diverse audiences. It's not an easy blockbuster. It taxes the mind as a show, as well as appeals to the emotions. In this, I think it is of our times, in ways that we should pay attention to. So I would say in the last 10 years, we have seen an absolute transformation in cultural habits that is relevant, I think, to everyone in this room. We might be sniffy about popular television, but we ought to pay attention to the proliferation of niche programmes that hinge on the sharing of arcane expertise or deep history. So from portrait making to pot throwing, baking to ballroom dancing, we get programmes that share expertise and aren't frightened of using specialist language. And I cite these programmes not to comment on a sort of dumbing down, but actually to say that I think there has been a massive shift toward discernment, expertise, and deep specialist knowledge, which is the museum and heritage sector's natural territory. So the really exciting cultural shift we want to seize at TATE is to say there is enthusiasm in our current cultural moment to take some bigger risks and make some artistic as well as culturally democratic wins in terms of who thinks we're relevant. So, why do we do all of this? I would say the great challenges of the 21st century, here in the UK and across the globe, are tackling intolerance between people, dealing with inequalities within society and the increasing social isolation of people of all ages. This impacts on people more if you are poor, it's exacerbated if you're elderly. The social problems, therefore, of the 21st century are the soft ones. How do we increase people's sense of belonging, their autonomy, their resilience, and their enjoyment in life? The smart money should be on the difference culture and heritage can make. And as a strategy, it creates space for museums and heritage spaces of all kinds to serve their core purpose for a wider range of people. I want to say here, I don't think that museums save lives, but I do think that they contribute to the living of a good life. They help make us better educated, more tolerant, more resilient, more mentally well, with better health and, vitally, back to those swings, with a cheerier outlook on life. And this is part of their intrinsic values for all who are welcomed in, to find what they want from our rich and varied collections. I'm not saying that museums should be doled out like medicine across the country, which is a very patrician, top-down view of culture as something that would be given to the masses. Rather, I think we should assume that our visitors come to find out things they don't know, as well as see things they do know, that we dumb down at our peril, and that we should think of people as adventurous and wild in their tastes. But we must remember that going on a journey into the unknown needs a certain degree of comfort, good walking shoes, if you like. And that as high cultural institutions or as heritage spaces, we have not always been terribly good at looking at what makes up the museum or the heritage house through the eyes of people who don't go, as well as those who currently do. So, we suffer still a dreadful negative correlation if I look across the data collected in the UK. This is that residents and households with the lowest income, poorest health and worst educational outcomes and poorest housing are also the least likely to be visiting museums or heritage in their city. That makes me feel really depressed. But I personally cannot change the lack of affordable social housing in London or anywhere else, or create more employment opportunities on a large scale. But I am certain I can try to break the reinforcing correlation that the people facing most challenge in our society do not feel welcome in the social and learning environments of our public museums or heritage houses. And this, for me, is what it boils down to. We haven't yet shifted for good the overall demographics of our audiences, as good as projects like Queer British Art or Soul of a Nation might be. To do this, people need to feel at home in our spaces. And if you were brought to a museum or a heritage house regularly when you were a child, and not just on a one-off school trip, and if you were raised to think you were allowed in, and that your own thoughts and ideas are valid, and that you see people like you represented on the walls and in the building, you own a bit of cultural wealth in a way that ultimately correlates to social and cultural and economic power. So my real challenge for the coming years at TATE is to ensure that the very real shift in audiences and perceptions in my galleries that we have seen this summer persist and don't represent a one-off spike. To my mind, our museums and heritage spaces can serve a gathering function. This was the slide I was looking for earlier, where people can come as the individual they are, but see themselves as part of a larger social whole, without having to join a club or agree with all that's being said. I'd argue that this kind of environment is incredibly hard to achieve, but absolutely necessary if museums and heritage spaces are to be genuinely engaged with the society we are now, sharing widely the good things that only our object-rich social and civic spaces can do. I want to close with an example that's not from TATE, but it seems so right for this conference. And it was something that I saw in Manchester, the place I have been until recently, just a couple of weeks ago. It is an extraordinary encounter with the relevance that a heritage institution was holding within it, untold until an artist discovered it. It takes us right back to the question of who can unlock the door. Nikhil Chopra, Indian artist, performance artist, is an extraordinary artist. I worked with him first in 2009 in Manchester, where he made a drawing performance over 18 days, drawing for 4 hours each day, exploring through his drawing practice the intertwined histories of British landscape painting, the British Raj, and Queen Victoria. In 2013, he completed part 2 of his engagement with Manchester when he rigged a vast Indian tent inside a half-finished gallery space at the Whitworth. We were in the middle of our capital expansion project for a 60-hour continuous performance, a drawing odyssey mapping the textiles districts of Manchester and Mumbai, connecting, drawing out the connections that had existed for 2 centuries between these 2 cities. We kept the gallery open around the clock for those 60 hours, and 11,500 people came to sit, eat, think, and sometimes sleep with him. He came back for this, a 3rd and final performance in Manchester, and in doing the research for this project, found a heritage object that unlocked a local and global history of partition. Locomotive 3157, that you can see here, was built in Manchester in 1911 and exported to India, where it served on the North West Railways, plying from Delhi to Punjab to Sindh for many years. In 1947, at partition, it was transferred to Pakistan, serving there until 1982, when General Zia decided to gift it to the museum in Manchester as part of his diplomatic efforts to persuade the UK government to support his regime. It only serves to remind us that museums are very often involved in the power play between governments. The locomotive evokes the powerful images of the many millions who use the railways to travel, willingly and unwillingly, to a new country. It also, unfortunately, invokes the massacres and displacement and hardship that took place during the division of one country into 2 and then 3. What interests me most about this example is that history And in a sense, this engine was inert in the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester until Nick Hill came on a research visit, ostensibly to look at the weaving machines in the textile gallery at the museum. He noticed the engine's Pakistani livery. By asking the simple question, how did this engine come to be here, Nick Hill unlocked a relevance that had otherwise been hidden. His subsequent performance, again over the course of 2 days and 2 nights, involved his father, who himself had lived through the experience of partition and had rarely spoken of it. It addressed the universal, the relationship between a father and son, between a people and a homeland, and it addressed pointed questions about which voices got heard and whose histories are remembered. As Nick Hill performed, he played through an incredible sequence of a soundscape in the space, many of the speeches given by Jinnah, Nehru and Gandhi that ran through the decade up to, through and after partition. The 48-hour performance became a reconstitution of a complex and contested history. It made another continent and a constituency present in the museum in a way that it had never been before, even though the object had been there since the museum was founded in 1982. It is this relevance we need to unlock into the futures of our museums and heritage spaces. Thank you, everyone.
Fantastic. Maria, thank you so much. Now, Maria has about 5 or 10 minutes before she has to leave to get her own train and has agreed to take some questions. I'm just going to do my own little take, as I did before, on this. Maria started with talking about the cultivation of joy. I loved that. This sort of cheerier outlook on life that you talked about is something quite lovely in the cultural sector. You talked about testing paradigms in local contexts. I think for a lot of us here that would have a lot of resonance. And about tackling the challenges in society, believing that there is an enthusiasm to take risks in a number of institutions. Yet, there is a big challenge, because actually it's the very people we would love to engage with who are often the ones who do not engage with the institutions that we represent. So the big questions at the end were, how do we build generations who feel an ownership and feel at home within the institutions and with the kind of art that we look after? And then who unlocks the door to of using the key of relevance, and that great example of Nick Hill's project up in Manchester. So a fantastic kind of travel log through quite a number of things there. I just want to come back to something else that you said at the beginning, if I may, which you referred obliquely to the social dimension that's important when we get public funding or private support for our institution. I just wondered if you'd say a few words about whether you generally find that there is support for these approaches, or where there are obstacles if there are not.
I think I've been, in terms of public support for museums and heritage, I think I have lived for the last more than a decade in a very fortunate city, but I don't think, in Manchester, but I don't think it's the only place where you could look for this kind of support. What I've seen over the last decade in Manchester is that as we, as museums and arts organisations in Manchester, made our social mission clearer, were more explicit about the ways in which we wanted to impact upon the world, the more support we drew in from local politicians, local funders, corporate support, and I think it is really interesting, corporate support and individual support. I think there's a kind of mistaken view that that philanthropists that want to support our kind of institutions only want their name on a door or a building. As some of them most definitely do want that, but I think they also want to know what difference that building or space is going to make for people. And so what politicians need and want, and what private supporters might also seek, are not necessarily at odds. And certainly in Manchester's case, the City Council itself became incredibly open about the way in which it supported culture and arts activity as a necessity for a 21st century city that wished to be competitive in an international scene. As the leader of the university would say, how can I attract a Nobel Prize winner to work here if there's nothing fantastic to do? So what are our students to do when they are not in their lectures, if not participate in the lively culture of a thriving city? And if you look at the other end of the economic spectrum, the many museums and heritage spaces, and I've seen from just the titles of the things that you've talked about over these last 4 days that many of you are involved in projects like this. Things like care of the elderly, support for dementia care, or recuperation from mental illness are not going to happen by pills alone. They happen by active participation in the social life of a city or a town. And heritage and arts organisations, just by doing what we do, are incredibly well placed to assist with this. I feel even more passionate and vitriolic, really, about the importance of arts, heritage and creativity in education, because I fear that we are narrowing our educational modes at exactly the moment we need young people to be opening their minds to the necessity of change being a way of life in the future. So none of us know the jobs that our children are likely to be doing. And arts and heritage are knowing our history and knowing that you have the resilience to go on, assist with that. So for me, the social and artistic, or the social and heritage aspects of what we do, have to be held really strongly together, because it's a necessity for the society I wish to live in, and it's also a necessity for the bottom line of my organisation.
Thank you. Great answer. Thank you. Now, we've got a little time for questions. Emma, kick things off.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this very inspiring presentation. I am Emma Nadi from Italy. Well, the core problem is prejudice, and you are fighting against prejudice and common sense. But it's easy to fight against prejudice that we have overcome. Nobody has prejudice anymore, I hope, about sexual preference of the color of the skin. But how can we identify today prejudice? For instance, I think Brexit, to my mind, is a terrible fact, not only for Europe, but also for the UK. And it stems from a prejudice. So how can you fight against today prejudice? The ones we have not overcome yet.
I'm afraid, although I sound quite an optimistic individual, I don't think we've overcome prejudice at all. I mean, there are... The organisations that I lead do not look like the city that I live in. We do not have enough black and minority ethnic staff. The Diversity Network made Queer British Art because a group of staff felt fearful about their ability, even today, to speak about their sexual identity. We had a rather amazing experience of having a chair of our Board of Trustees, Lord John Brown, a very influential man, outed by the Daily Mail, ruined his career. He had to resign from BP and has reconstituted a career post that with the absolutely brave and bold admission that he should have come out earlier. Now, all of this is very, very recent and still present with us. Now, I agree with you absolutely about the challenges that Brexit face. To me, the Brexit vote happened because we were not paying enough attention. We were kind of not wanting to look at what was not changing over there. We weren't paying enough attention to economic inequalities. You know, you can look at London or Manchester, or you could look at Rome or Paris and say these are cities that are thriving. And in some measures they are, but they are not including a wider range of people, and we are not necessarily addressing the things that divide people from each other. And I would say that museums and heritage spaces, because of the long history, like this engine, because of the long histories that they hold, have a particular role to create a space where we can have an argument, and I think it is an argument that's needed, where there can be dissent, but in a place that is safe to do that, that doesn't allow things to become polarized, that doesn't become vicious in the way that you see across certain social media platforms. I think we have, as public institutions, a civic responsibility to create a safe space to argue about the cities and the cultures that we want to live in. And that's our present task.
Any more questions for Maria? Yes?
Sometimes I'm wondering, hello, I'm Angela from the Netherlands. How can we prepare the youngest on the 21st century skills when we are actually old school ourselves? We try to be open-minded, but we are 50 years old. So...
Everyone.
Yeah, I'm nearly 50 as well. So I think there are concrete, practical things that we can do. So I would like to have a young person on the board at TATE. That means I'll have to go to government to create a new seat for that person. But I think that's right, because everybody else on the board is as old as me or older, or a lot older. I think we need young people leading the programmes of work in our institutions, and I've seen that work incredibly successfully in Manchester, in TATE. The TATE collectives have authority and autonomy within the institution, and so they are shaping what they need rather than us imagining what we think they need. And I think that it's that empowerment of many different kinds and constituencies of people that's absolutely necessary. And I think we have to make it absolutely clear that from the very youngest age, young people are welcome. So from babies are welcome. Now, I mean, my children are 20 and 18, so I can remember the time when you really were not allowed to take babies into art galleries. If they cried, you'd be frowned at if you were lucky, or asked to leave if you were unlucky. I am glad that over the last 20 years that has changed really fundamentally. But it took campaigning. It took actually a UK journalist in this country to set up a Kids in Museum campaign because her child was asked to leave the Royal Academy because he shouted "monster" when he saw a picture of a monster. So there has been massive change. We need to make sure that that young people are empowered so that they can lead the next phase of change.
Here. More questions?
Good morning. Thank you for your great, inspiring speech. I was in the Barbara Hepworth House Museum in Cornwall a few weeks ago, just before the opening of the, unfortunately. I was wondering, in which way are you incorporating the House Museum and the ideas you mentioned this morning?
Well, it's a very small museum, but it actually tells a complex personal but also international history. And I think what you would see if you went back this week in St Ives is a very natural relationship between this small house, was a studio and garden, with wonderful sculptures by Hepworth sited there, and then TATE St Ives, where in the refurbished gallery spaces we now talk about a history of St Ives and British modernism in a way that is gender balanced. So you walk into one room, there's a marvellous Sandra Blow as one of the first paintings that you'll see opposite Nicholson and Piper and all the others that you would expect. But also it tells a story that is absolutely international. And so it teaches us, reminds us that, again, even in places like St Ives that have become very associated with particular high cultural artists, there is an international network of connections that was forging what we understand to be modernist art history or British art history. So there's some small stuff from the archive that for me made the whole exhibition. There's a brilliant Ben Nicholson white relief next to a Mondrian painting, and in a case there's a little seaside postcard where Mondrian writes to Nicholson. They were in back and forth correspondence. People from all over the world came to St Ives because of the art, because the artists there invited them. And so there has been global exchange and dialogue all the way through the 20th century and the 19th. And it's very important that we present that as part of the story.
Okay, thank you so much.
Any other questions?
Hello, thank you for your talk. I'm actually representing a small institution from Southwark, Flat Time House, and I was wondering what advice you might give to smaller institutions that don't have the resources of TATE.
Yes, well, I mean, one of the things that the expanded TATE Modern has allowed is partnership with much smaller organisations, especially in our kind of local neighbourhood. So some of the associates that have been resident in TATE Exchange have been grassroots, artist-led organisations from Southwark. And I think it is important that we have relationships with what is coming through, even though TATE is the kind of the big boy on the block. But I would say that the same things that I'm talking about pertain to your scale of organisation. That often the very locally rooted, the organically connected small organisation are giving huge social value to their neighbourhoods and to the people that they engage with. And I think it's interesting to notice at the moment how the Mayor's office, in particular in London, is actually quite panicked about how they are going to hold on to a notion of creativity in London. And so they are talking about how they keep artist studios in the city. They are talking about how they might start to think about zoning for creativity and culture. And I think it's essential, because if small organisations aren't supported to make a difference in their neighbourhood, how people connect to place won't happen. So I would say make the strongest possible argument for the social as well as the artistic or heritage value of what you are doing, and hang on, because the city needs you.
Maria, thank you so much for coming to us today, talking to us so passionately, actually, about everything that you believe in. I think you'll find a lot of nodding heads in the room, and a real interest to be working in the same kinds of ways. More power to your elbow, more power to TATE, galleries, fantastic places. For now, I'm afraid we're going to say goodbye to Maria, and then we'll please don't move, because we're going to then move into another very quick session. But, go on.
Thank you very much.